Some people are born with a fire inside them, but for Robert Smith, it was more than just a metaphor. From a young age, his uncontrollable urge to start fires marked him as different, branded with the nickname Pyro. But that wasn't the only thing that burned inside him. Jealousy, betrayal, and rage were close behind. And when they ignited, they would change everything forever. The soft hum of the engine and the smell of oil on his hands always reminded Robert Smith of the life he had built. Steady, methodical, and in control. But beneath the surface, he knew the truth. He wasn't in control. At 34, Robert looked back on his past, filled with regret, shame, and the ever-present fire that had consumed him. Not just the literal flames of his youth, but the inner rage that had always been there, waiting to erupt. Pyro, they called him, a name he hated, yet couldn't shake. As a child, it had been just an innocent nickname, a reflection of the little fires he'd started, the explosions of impulsive energy that had threatened to ruin everything. But as he grew older, that name became a reminder of the monster lurking inside him. The uncontrollable need to burn, to destroy. The scars he'd tried so hard to hide. Robert would never forget the first time the fire consumed him. It wasn't just an accident. It was a compulsion, an insatiable pull that led him to set the family barn alight at 16. That fire nearly tore his life apart, and ever since he'd been walking a fine line between suppression and chaos. Now, as an adult, he had learned to mask the darkness, to appear normal. His job as an industrial mechanic was steady, routine. He was building a life, one small, calculated step at a time. But it was a facade, a thin veil. He knew he was one spark away from losing everything. When he met Sarah, it seemed like the answer to his turmoil. She was his anchor, a sweet, caring schoolteacher with a warmth that made him feel normal, human. They got married, and for a while, it felt like everything was perfect. But perfection was always temporary for Robert. Deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before the old fire inside him would catch again. It all started when Robert was just a boy. He remembers the first time he felt the spark, quite literally. He was only 8 years old, playing with matches behind his father's workshop, trying to create something that wasn't supposed to be. At first, it was small, harmless even, just a flicker of excitement as the flames danced. But before long, that little flame grew, and the fire spread faster than he could contain. The blaze consumed his entire backyard in minutes, and when the fire department arrived, it wasn't just the damage to the property that shocked them. It was the look in Robert's eyes. He wasn't scared. He wasn't crying. He wasn't even apologetic. There was something about the fire that thrilled him, something primal that he couldn't explain. It was an escape, a release, a control that he never felt anywhere else. His parents sent him to therapy, tried to teach him control, but the flames never fully left his heart. The more they tried to extinguish his urges, the more they flared up. By the time he was a teenager, he was already known around town for his fire-setting incidents. When Robert turned 16, his pyromania reached its peak. He was caught after setting fire to a field behind his school, an act that almost ended his future. The authorities intervened, and the therapy intensified, but the real damage was internal. The shame and guilt weighed on him, but the desire, the pull to set something alight, never disappeared. He went through years of struggling with it, pushing the urge down, burying it beneath layers of guilt and fear. But no matter how much he fought, the flames were always there, just below the surface, waiting for a trigger. Sarah came into Robert's life like a sudden breath of fresh air after years of choking on smoke. She was everything he wasn't, stable, radiant, grounded in the everyday world that seemed so far from his own chaotic existence. Robert was 28 when they first met. At the time, he was still fighting the urge that always clawed at him from the inside. He'd managed to keep it buried under years of therapy and self-control, but the flames were never too far out of reach. They met at a local coffee shop. Robert had been sitting alone, nursing a lukewarm coffee while reading a mechanic's manual. Sarah, with her warm smile and easy laughter, sat down beside him after a mix-up with seating. She wasn't looking for a relationship, she said, but the conversation between them flowed so naturally that neither of them could deny the instant connection. It wasn't just her kindness that drew Robert in, it was her understanding. She didn't see him as broken, as a man with a past that might never truly be erased. Sarah saw him for who he was in that moment, a man who wanted better, who wanted to change. And for the first time in years, Robert thought he could. He thought he could be normal, just like everyone else. Their relationship blossomed quickly. They shared everything, from late-night talks about their childhoods to casual walks through the city. Sarah never pushed Robert to talk about his past. Instead, she gave him space and time to reveal himself when he was ready. And slowly, Robert opened up. He told her about the fires, about the uncontrollable urge that had haunted him for years. He expected her to pull away, to be repelled by his darkness. But Sarah didn't flinch. She listened without judgment, as if the man she loved wasn't defined by his past. Their marriage was the culmination of everything Robert had hoped for. A fresh start, a new chapter. For the first time in his life, Robert felt the possibility of a future that wasn't overshadowed by the ever-present fear of his destructive urges. But as happy as he was, deep down, a part of him remained wary. He knew the fire never truly went out. It only lay dormant, waiting for the right moment to flare back up. When Robert's younger brother, William, entered the picture, it felt like the return of an old, familiar enemy, one Robert had long thought he'd buried. William was 30, just a year younger than Robert, but in so many ways he was everything Robert wasn't. Successful, outgoing, always in control. He was the life of every party, the kind of man who could walk into a room and instantly become the center of attention. Robert had always looked up to him, but as the years went by, that admiration twisted into something darker. While Robert was stuck in his small world of mechanics, trying to fight his demons, William had built a career in real estate, flying high with his business acumen and charm. William seemed to get everything with ease. He wasn't just popular. He was respected, and people admired him in a way they never did Robert. When William came to visit, it was meant to be a simple family reunion, but for Robert it felt like a reawakening of his deepest insecurities. He couldn't help but feel overshadowed, like the little brother again, struggling to find his place in the shadow of someone who could do no wrong. The constant comparisons, both spoken and unspoken, gnawed at Robert's insides. William was always the one with the golden touch, the perfect life, the perfect job. And Robert, he was the guy still fixing broken-down cars, still living in the past, trying to fight an old urge he couldn't escape. It wasn't just jealousy, it was a deep, simmering resentment. Robert didn't want to feel this way. He wanted to be happy for his brother. But no matter how hard he tried to push it down, the envy festered. It wasn't just the success. It was the way William carried himself, the ease with which he navigated life, while Robert felt trapped in his own struggles, unable to break free. Their relationship, once close and filled with shared childhood memories, began to feel strained. Robert found himself avoiding William, feeling like he was constantly measuring himself against a man who seemed to have it all. It wasn't just the success that bothered Robert. It was the attention, the adoration, the way people seemed to gravitate toward William without any effort. Robert hated how easily his brother could command a room, and he couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what he did, he would always come up second best. It started innocently enough, a casual family gathering at Robert and Sarah's home. William had come over for the weekend, as he often did. There was laughter, music playing softly in the background, and the clinking of glasses. Sarah and Robert had been happily married for a few years now, and for the most part, life seemed to be on track. But that night, something felt off. Robert couldn't quite put his finger on it at first, but as the evening went on, he noticed it more and more. Sarah and William. There was a tension between them, something that wasn't there before. It wasn't obvious to anyone else, but Robert could see it. The way Sarah would laugh just a little too long at something William said, her eyes lingering on him a little too intently. And William, his usual charming self, seemed to be soaking it all in, his hand lingering on Sarah's shoulder a moment too long after a joke, his gaze following her more than it should have. Robert told himself he was imagining things. He tried to brush it off, thinking that perhaps his insecurities were playing tricks on him. But then, as the night wore on, it became impossible to ignore. There was a familiarity between them that made Robert uncomfortable. They were supposed to be family, yet in that moment Robert felt like an outsider, like a stranger in his own home. He noticed that every time he left the room they'd exchange glances, quick, knowing looks that made his stomach churn. It wasn't just casual conversation. There was something deeper, something charged about the way they interacted. Robert felt his heart rate quicken, his breath becoming shallow as the unease grew. He excused himself and stepped outside, needing air to clear his head. But as he stood in the cold, staring up at the dark sky, his mind raced. Could it be? Could they be? No, Robert thought. He couldn't let himself believe it. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted, and it began to grow. The trust he had in both Sarah and William, the people he loved the most, was starting to crack. As the days passed after the family gathering, Robert's suspicions grew. He tried to convince himself that it was just his jealousy rearing its ugly head, that there was no reason to think anything had happened between Sarah and William. But something was off, and he couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't long before the truth came to light in the most unexpected and gut-wrenching way. Robert was out of town on a work trip when he received a call from a close friend, someone he trusted. The voice on the other end was shaky, hesitant, and the words that came next felt like a punch to the gut. "Robert, I don't know how to tell you this, but I saw Sarah and William together. In your bed." At first, Robert didn't understand. He thought it was a joke, but the silence on the other end of the line told him everything he needed to know. His heart stopped. His mind couldn't process the information. Sarah, the woman he loved, the one he had trusted with his darkest secrets, had betrayed him, and William, his own flesh and blood, had betrayed him as well. It was as if the world tilted beneath him, and Robert was left standing in the rubble of everything he thought he knew. The anger began to bubble up, but it was different this time. It wasn't the explosive rage that had once been a part of him. This time, it was cold, calculating. He felt humiliated, betrayed in a way he couldn't have prepared for. The two people he loved most in the world had crossed a line that could never be undone. The shame and hurt that flooded Robert were overwhelming. He had always been the one to bury his emotions, to hide his darker impulses behind a mask of control. But now, with this revelation, it was as if everything he had built was crumbling. His marriage, his relationship with his brother, everything he had worked for, it was all a lie. As the reality set in, Robert found himself spiraling. He wasn't sure how to move forward, what to do with the unbearable weight of the betrayal. All he knew was that something had to be done. He could feel the old urge stirring inside him, the need for revenge, for retribution. It was no longer about the fire, it was about making them feel the pain he was feeling. As the days stretched on, Robert was consumed by the need for revenge. The hurt and betrayal he felt from Sarah and William were like a slow-burning fuse, inching closer to an explosion that Robert could no longer ignore. He had always prided himself on keeping his emotions in check, controlling the rage that had once defined him, but now that control was slipping through his fingers. He needed to make them understand the pain they had caused him. The idea of revenge started to take shape slowly at first, thoughts swirling in his mind like smoke. He couldn't just confront them, couldn't just shout at them and let it all out. No, it had to be something more, something that would leave a lasting impact, something that would make them feel the same emptiness he now carried. He thought about how they had destroyed everything he'd worked so hard to build. Sarah had been the one who promised him a future, the woman who had accepted his past with no judgment. William, his own brother, had been the one he trusted above all others, and now they had taken that trust and crushed it. The plan wasn't spontaneous. It was carefully calculated. Robert knew he had to be precise, meticulous in his execution. He could have confronted them, exposed their betrayal, but that would have been too easy, too quick. No, Robert wanted them to feel the weight of their actions, to understand the consequences of crossing him. He had always been drawn to fire, always felt a strange pull toward it. And now, that pull was the only thing that seemed to make sense. Sarah's car, a gift Robert had bought her just a year earlier, would be the perfect target. It was her pride and joy, the symbol of everything they had worked for together. Robert had always felt a strange connection to that car, the way it gleamed in the sunlight, the way Sarah looked at it with such affection. Now, it would be the thing that would make them feel his wrath. He began to plan meticulously. He'd waited until late one night when Sarah was out of town for work, and William was nowhere in sight. Robert snuck into the garage, carrying with him a can of gasoline and a lighter. He'd seen this before, had watched the flames grow from nothing into something that could consume everything in its path. The fire would be the perfect revenge. It would erase the symbol of their betrayal. As the gasoline poured over the car's hood, Robert felt a sick satisfaction. The act of destruction, of reclaiming control, filled the void inside him. The fire would be his message. No more pretending, no more hiding. It was time to make them understand. Robert struck the match and watched as it flickered in the darkness. For a moment it felt like time had slowed down. The match burned brightly, then he dropped it onto the gasoline-soaked car. The flames erupted instantly, hissing and crackling as they climbed the sides of the vehicle. It was a perfect execution. The fire spread quickly, the heat intense as it engulfed the car in a matter of seconds. Robert stood there watching the inferno, feeling a strange sense of release. The fire wasn't just a physical act, it was a metaphor, a cleansing. It was the embodiment of everything Robert had been feeling. The burning anger, the betrayal, the sense of being consumed by the people he trusted the most. As the car melted, twisted by the flames, Robert felt a strange peace settle over him. It wasn't joy, but it was something close to it. In that moment, he had reclaimed control. But even as the fire raged, Robert's satisfaction began to sour. As he stood there watching the flames, a part of him started to question whether this was really what he wanted. Had it been worth it? Was the destruction, the revenge, the fire, was it enough to erase the pain they had caused him? The sound of sirens in the distance broke him from his thoughts, and Robert quickly turned to leave, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done it. He had sent his message. But as he walked away from the burning wreckage, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him. The satisfaction was fleeting, replaced by a gnawing emptiness. The fire, while intense, hadn't provided the closure he had hoped for. It had only deepened the void. By the time the fire department arrived, the car was reduced to a charred shell. Robert disappeared into the shadows, retreating back into the life he had once tried so hard to control. But deep down, he knew that nothing would ever be the same. The fire had burned away more than just the car. It had burned away the remnants of the life he had once known. And in its place was a man who no longer knew where he stood, a man who had crossed a line he could never uncross. In the days following the fire, Robert tried to carry on with his life as if nothing had changed, but it was impossible. The weight of his actions began to settle heavily on him, creeping into his thoughts during every waking moment. At first, he had felt a sense of victory, a sense of justice in his heart, but that satisfaction was fleeting. The fire, while it had been the perfect symbol of his anger, didn't give him the peace he had hoped for. Sarah, of course, found out about the car within hours. The news spread quickly, as fires of any kind always do in small towns. Robert had thought he could hide from the consequences, but it was impossible to escape. Sarah's face when she saw what had happened was burned into his mind. The hurt in her eyes, the way she looked at him as if she didn't even recognize him anymore. It was almost too much to bear. She confronted him, of course. And Robert, who had once been so good at keeping his emotions hidden, found himself unable to speak. The guilt was overwhelming. Sarah didn't even raise her voice. She didn't need to. The silence between them was far more powerful than any words could have been. In that moment, Robert realized that the fire had not only destroyed her car, it had destroyed their relationship. But that wasn't the worst of it. When William found out, it felt like the final nail in the coffin. Robert's brother, who he had once trusted more than anyone in the world, looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and contempt. It wasn't just the destruction of the car that angered William. It was the betrayal. The way Robert had let his anger fester and turn into something so destructive. The fire, in a way, was the physical manifestation of the damage that had already been done to their brotherly bond. The fallout was swift and brutal. Sarah, heartbroken and unable to trust Robert anymore, left him. She took the house, the life they had built together, and everything that had once felt solid began to crumble. William, too, distanced himself. He couldn't look at Robert the same way after the fire, after the betrayal. Robert was left standing alone in the wreckage of his life, surrounded by the aftermath of his own destructive actions. The guilt gnawed at him every minute of the day. He had wanted revenge, but now all he felt was the crushing weight of regret. What had he really accomplished? He had burned the car, but in the process, he had burned everything else too. His marriage, his relationship with his brother, his own sense of self. Robert realized that no matter how much he tried to deny it, he had crossed a line from which there was no return. The fire had consumed more than just material things. It had consumed the very foundation of his life. As weeks turned into months, Robert tried to move on, but the damage was done. His life, once full of possibilities, was now nothing more than a shell of what it had been. His apartment felt cold and empty, a far cry from the home he had shared with Sarah. The memories of their time together, the laughter, the shared dreams, the quiet moments, felt like a distant dream. Every corner of his apartment seemed to mock him, a reminder of what he had lost. He tried to fill the void with work, throwing himself into his job at the mechanic shop, but the distraction was temporary. He couldn't outrun the reality of what he had done. The fire, the betrayal, the hurt. It followed him everywhere, a constant shadow that loomed over him, reminding him of his failings. Robert knew he could never go back to the man he was before. The man who had fought so hard to keep the darkness inside him at bay was gone. In his place stood a man broken by his own choices, a man who had let anger consume him. The fire that had once felt like a release had now become a symbol of his own self-destruction. His relationship with William was beyond repair. The bond they had once shared, built on years of shared experiences and brotherly trust, had been burned away in the flames of Robert's anger. They hadn't spoken since the fire, and Robert knew, deep down, that they never would again. No apology, no attempt at reconciliation could erase the damage that had been done. Sarah, too, was gone. She had moved on, or at least that's what Robert told himself. He had no idea where she was now or if she had found happiness again, but he couldn't bring himself to reach out. She had trusted him, loved him, and he had betrayed her in the worst way possible. What could he say? How could he fix something that was broken beyond repair? Now, as he sat alone in his small apartment, the silence deafening, Robert wondered if he would ever find peace. The fire had given him the moment of release he had been craving, but it had also taken everything away. He was left with nothing but the ashes of his former life, and the gnawing knowledge that he had been the one to destroy it all. As he looked out the window at the darkened streets below, Robert knew one thing for sure. He could never escape his past. It would follow him, haunt him, no matter where he went. And for the rest of his life, he would live with the consequences of the fire he had started. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to my channel for more. Your support means a lot.